Okay, so in this video, we're going to take a look at swaps in finance and a very basic type of swap, but there are many different types and many varieties of swap. But the most popular type of swap and most basic is, of course, the interest rate swap. That's where you'd exchange two interest rates, interest rate swap. Now, could be something very basic would be, again, you have A and you have B. And in that A and B, perhaps A is paying a fixed rate, let's say 5%, and in exchange, B is paying a floating rate, and that could be linked to some market benchmark like LIBOR. LIBOR swaps, I think, accounts for something like 90% of all interest rate swaps. In recent years, LIBOR has become a bit discredited, in part because the LIBOR rate, a number of the blue chip banks operating in the London market were fined for manipulating, and manipulation of interest rates is something that you don't want, and it actually has partially heavily impacted on the market, right? So people are looking around to see, are there alternatives for LIBOR? You would imagine that's quite straightforward. In fact, it's not. And I'm sure there will be a lot of energy devoted towards revamping. But in a traditional swap, the typical floating rate, this LIBOR, if you like, is like a blue chip, where you have a AA rating for a given bank, and they negotiate. The L here denotes London, and the London Interbank offer rate, for historical reasons, accidentally became the leading, if you like, benchmark. Most interest rates in the US would have been seen as being also slightly manipulated, in the sense that if we consider the Treasury bill rate, or the Fed funds rate, these rates tend to be heavily controlled by government. They are, in fact, government rates. And if you were looking around for a kind of market rate, right, a rate that reflected market conditions, LIBOR seemed to offer some possibilities there. So setting out the very basic swap, then you have A, and they agree, let's say, to pay a fixed rate of interest, and in return you get a floating rate, which we said could be LIBOR, and the two come together. Now, also important here with a swap, you have a series. Okay, you typically have a series of exchanges. Typically have a series of exchange at some probably uniform interval. So every 6 months, uniform interval, and that would last perhaps not unusual 5 years, could be the maturity here, or 10 years. And it's not uncommon to have interest rate swaps that go up to 30 years. And because of the longer maturities, it was believed that interest rate swaps provided the market with quite a bit of information. So one of the major benefits of the development of the swaps market in the 1980s, many analysts felt that the swaps market somehow filled in missing information. And of course, that still continues to be the case, despite our concerns in terms of manipulation of the LIBOR interest rate. Right. Okay. So what's the rationale then for the swap? Well, it could very simply be, let's take a simple case here. We have A. Let's say A is currently in a situation where they are paying out a floating rate on a loan. So they have a LIBOR denominated loan, pre-existing, and they expect for maybe the next 5 years they're going to pay a floating rate. And chances are there's a possibility when they review their situation, perhaps they think they are not comfortable with the risk profile of having a floating rate or a LIBOR rate. So they negotiate a loan. The loan is denominated in terms of a LIBOR rate. We would have typically the sum involved in terms of borrowing could be quite high, so perhaps maybe $1 million had been borrowed, and the A wants to convert this floating rate exposure to a fixed rate exposure. One way you could, of course, do this is go back to your bank and renegotiate the terms of the loan. But that can be fraught. Sometimes there are legal costs with that. And one of the benefits of entering the swap is the swap just sits right on top of the existing loan, and you have no discussions with your bank. You basically find a counterparty, B, and B agrees, look, we will accept 5%, and in return, we will pay you the LIBOR rate. Now, the effect of that, when we look at this approach here, what does this do if we can net out the payments? The LIBOR rate that is being paid to A would cancel with B. So we would cancel with the bank. So the LIBOR rate here would cancel this LIBOR rate, and A would net out to 5%. Of course, in the terms of the swap here, we would have to agree a notional principal. So that's typically something that is agreed when we set up the swap. Normally, a swap in an OTC market would conform to an ISDA, International Derivative Association, would conform to an ISDA master agreement. So if this was in an OTC market, normally the two counterparties here would sign basically a 2-page document where they'd fill in the relevant gaps. They would agree the notional principal. They would agree the term of the swap would be 5 years. Was the payment going to be each year? So was the payment going to be each year, 1 per year, 2 per year, every 6 months? Was it a biannual exchange? So that would be agreed. The frequency of the loan would be agreed. That would be filled in the 2-page document. But then it would be made clear in the 2-page document that all the other terms underpinning the swap would map into the ISDA master agreement. And that was convenient to have these agreements because it wouldn't imply then if there was a disagreement occurred subsequently, both counterparties could go back and take a look at the master agreement. So essential to the market infrastructure here for swap agreements, particularly for interest rate swaps, you have a ISDA master agreements. And ISDA is really, it's a private organization, not public. So not a judicial body, but typically wouldn't ensure that the master agreement is consistent with the legal framework of a given jurisdiction. And then counterparties, if they're in America or Britain or France, would not necessarily have to worry about the legal underpinnings of the contract. Now, again, if we look at this for a moment, it's quite reminiscent. We take the A and the B for a moment. A is paying 5%. B is paying the LIBOR rate. A's position is a series. It could be, again, it could be a 5-year swap, right? And so exchanges occur in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. So this exchange is happening each year over the 5-year term, and could be once a year or even higher frequency. The position of A would look like a long forward position, paying 5. If the LIBOR rate then subsequently went up, A is gaining on the position, so that looks like A's position. And B here, it would appear to have the counterparty here, B, would have the offsetting position. It would look like a short position again, the delivery price, if you like, at 5%, and we would have LIBOR. So the gain or loss on the position would be very reminiscent of a long futures or long forward position, and for B, a short forward position. The only difference here, it's not a once-off exchange. With a swap, you typically get a series of payments for a predetermined term. So 1-year swap, a 10-year swap, a 5-year swap, and indeed, not uncommon, 30-year swap. Okay, so that's a simplified introduction to interest rate swaps. And obviously, again, part of the motivation here is, but we'll look later at comparative and absolute advantage, but a very simple motivation for entering into a swap would be to convert, in our case, we had a floating rate liability and we converted that into a fixed rate. So if you receive LIBOR from A, that offsets the existing loan that you're mandated to pay each year. Of course, we'd have to make sure the notional principal was equal to the amount of the original loan. And then A's position nets out to be 5%. So if they contract to pay 5, receive LIBOR, the LIBOR that they receive cancels with the loan, the interest on the loan, if the loan was denominated as a LIBOR interest rate, and A would end up with a fixed rate. And that might give them peace of mind. And again, in this respect, we might see the swap as a form of insurance. Okay, now later on we'll explore other motivations for entering into swaps, but this obviously is one. Hedging interest rates is obviously one motivation. Okay,